I start with apologies that I'll speak in English because of my poor language skills. My reading in Spanish is not too bad and my Portuguese is bad, but I will try harder, I promise, but thank you. So today I will be talking to you about Tintagel, and I hope some of you might have been or will get there in the future. And specifically, we're talking about imported pottery of mostly 5th and 6th century date that is found in Western Britain and principally in the southwest part of Britain where Tintagel is. And I should stress before we start that there aren't huge volumes of this material. There's a lot being written about it. There's a lot of research that's been done on it, but they aren't vast quantities of material. And it's certainly not like the scope of the imported fine wares that we have in Roman period Britain. These fine wares are found in post-Roman sites, quite often in different sites that were occupied in the sort of Roman period in Britain. But we're talking about things that arrived after the kind of traditional end of Roman Britain in the early 5th century. These are later finds, usually from different sites. So we have fineware pottery, the majority of which is late Roman Cephasy red slip, coming from sort of the regions of Western Turkey. We also do have some African red slip, and there's quite a constrained package of forms and subtypes for these that do kind of suggest quite a constrained date range for these arrivals, as I've said, in the later 5th and first half of the 6th century. The majority of what we have for these imports are amphora, and most of these are of East Mediterranean types. So if we look at the sort of Riley's classification sequence of late Roman 1, late Roman 2, late Roman 3, we do have these types, principally late Roman 1 and late Roman 2, with smaller amounts of late Roman 3. In older British publications, you might see this other classification system, which is sort of the opposite way around, which is a bit of a pain. But mostly now in publications, we're seeing the same kind of terminology used. As a hangover from that earlier system, though, we do have this group that is being called B5 in reports from Britain. And previously that's been thought to be of sort of North African origin. But now we think that that might be coming from possibly from southern Spain, something that was suggested by Paul Reynolds quite a while ago. But looking at the material now, we do think that that's correct, that this is a lot of this group is probably coming from southern Spain, but I'll come back to this. I'm just showing this picture quickly. This is John Riley, who I met at Tintagel. He was very interested to see where his research had gone, and that people are still using these systems that he helped to develop. But just looking at those kind of closer classifications of the amphoras, this is Pieri's subtypes. In terms of the late Roman 1, what we tend to have is this kind of transitional late Roman 1 shape, with a couple of examples on either side. But again, this seems to suggest this date range of later 5th, first half of the 6th century as that kind of main phase of importation. Just looking at the origins of this material, late Roman 2, we've really got coming from the central, sort of from the Peloponnese, so from mainland Greece. The late Roman 1 that we have, and again, I'll come back to this, we think is probably coming from the northeast Mediterranean, so southern Turkey, possibly Syria, but probably not from Cyprus, we think. It's probably coming from the mainland areas. And also we've got late Roman 3 coming from the sort of Aphrodisias, Ephesus area of Western Turkey. In the sort of British literature, we have this sort of second phase of imports coming from the continent. This DSPA, which now we think is probably contemporary with the Mediterranean imports. Previously, it's been seen to be a kind of slightly later phase, but we do think it's about the same date. But there is definitely a later phase of courseware imports called e-ware, which we now think probably comes from the Bordeaux area and has a kind of wider distribution up Western Britain and Ireland, but also down the Atlantic seaboard. And there is also glassware, and there is glassware at Tintagel, but I'm not going to talk about that. But when the report comes out from the recent excavations, you'll see that there's some very interesting glasswares from the site. Interestingly, Tintagel doesn't have any eWare, which is quite surprising. And it seems to suggest that Tintagel drops out of these longer distance connections sometime in the mid-6th century, when this phase of eWare seems to be reaching into the sort of northern Atlantic region. So this is a bit of an oversimplification, but we have this model of these imports being in Western Britain, in the regions thought to sort of linked to the British populations in post-Roman Britain, and they aren't found in eastern areas, which are sort of linked to areas of Saxon settlement and expansion. And this does seem to bear out that there is a sort of divide between eastern and western Britain, but this is a sort of complicated question of culture. But we do seem to think that there are two routes whereby material reached post-Roman Britain. We have an Atlantic route where these imported pottery and connected commodities arrived, but there's a sort of overland route whereby precious metal vessels arrived in Eastern Britain by sort of river systems and things. So for instance, there are Byzantine silverware vessels in the burials at Sutton Hoo, which potentially arrived via the sort of continental riverine systems. But interestingly, some of that material is actually quite a lot earlier than the date of the burials. So it's interesting to think maybe this arrived by another routeway and was sort of in circulation for a good century or something. And actually, this Anastasius platter from the Sutton Hoo burial is pretty much the same date as the imported fine wares. If we look at the distribution of these wares in Britain, you can see it's very much concentrated on the southwest. And this is Ewan Campbell's map from 2011. And that very large circle is Tintagel, which has by far the largest quantity of this material. And that other circle next to it is a site at Bantham in the southwest nearby, which is the sort of second largest assemblage. So just to show you some of these sites in the southwest, you can see Tintagel here on the north coast of Cornwall. And I'll show you some of those other sites. So you can see Mothercombe here, I'll mention, and Bantham on the south coast of, this is in Devon, quite close to Dartmoor. And Dartmoor is an area where we have evidence suggesting tin streaming in this period. So the production of tin. And although it's not right next to Tintagel, we do think Tintagel as well is linked to potentially the control of tin extraction in the wider region. So there's a long history of this research in Britain, and although they didn't know where this material was from at the time, they have been recording these East Mediterranean imports from the 19th century. This is some amphora sherds that were illustrated from Devon, from the site of High Peak, which again you can see on that map just over to the east of Mothercombe and Bantham. I mentioned Bantham is this sort of second largest site in terms of quantity. And again, you can see from the amphora that we have this focus on East Mediterranean finds. At Bantham, very much late Roman 1, whereas Tintagel seems to have a lot more of this late Roman 2 coming from the Greek mainland, but also other types of amphora as well. And my own kind of sort of link to this research came from some excavations at Mothercombe, which again we think is a site where has some connection to tin production activity in the Devon region. And this had a very small quantity of sherds, possibly only about less than 20 examples, but it does show that it's connected into these sort of wider systems. Just to show you another site, this is the site at Cadbury Castle, or South Cadbury on the map there. And you can see where these East Mediterranean amphitheatres have been displayed in the museum because they're sort of rare, and they're seen as sort of important and an important connection for the place. And like a lot of these sites, this site is interpreted as a kind of regional power base. Some of these sites are seen as royal sites, and in fact, Tintagel is thought to be potentially a royal site. And as I mentioned, this distribution in the southwest of Britain is tied quite closely to the production of tin, and also a sort of other metals in the sort of wider southwest. But as I say, it's not just Britain. There is a sort of wider distribution of these imports up the western coast of Britain, and also into Ireland, where there's a lot of work being going on. Most recently, Ian Doyle's production from Garons, which has the same sort of types of material that we're seeing at these sites in southwest Britain, late Roman I amphoras, late Roman II, really quite similar to Tintagel. And you can see that map of distribution there. So just to sum up, in terms of this distribution in Britain, I've suggested it's something new. It's not a kind of Roman system. It's something different. Not huge quantities of material, but they tend to be seen as quite important for the kind of connections that these sites have, which are particularly royal sites, or otherwise potentially coastal trading sites. Mostly on the coast, but about half of the entire material of these imports is at one site, which is Tintagel. And at Tintagel, about 95% of the entire ceramic group is imported. So there is a very small group of locally produced ceramics, but the bulk of the material is imported from the Mediterranean region. So there was this sort of older model of direct contact between the East Mediterranean, between the Byzantine state and sites in southwest Britain. And this was largely due to the lack of knowledge about material from the sort of intervening areas. And this goes right back to some early work by Bernard Wales, who looked at sort of comparable material. And because there was material in both of these regions, links were drawn between them and direct lines of trade. And this is something that I was looking at in my thesis. But as I mentioned, this kind of overlooked the work that was going on in Spain and Portugal. So here's Collis Fabiau's map from 2009 of late Roman sea for sea and red slip production, which shows that this is very well distributed up the coast of Portugal and northwest Spain. And we can really now see that the British material is the northern edge of a much wider Atlantic distribution. So this is something that I sort of discussed and mapped out in my thesis. And I wrote this for a UK audience, really. This material was known about by researchers in Spain and Portugal, but it was really for me to set that in the context for researchers working in Britain, that the British material was not unique in the Atlantic, that it was part of a wider distribution. And at the same time, as I was kind of working on this, Adolfo Fernandez published the large group of material from Vigo, which we think is now sort of operating as a sort of emporium site, or a site of redistribution for these systems in the Atlantic. And my thinking is that most of the British material is being filtered through sites, ports like Vigo, potentially other sites, and that the material isn't arriving directly from the East Mediterranean. We have these chains of transmission from the Byzantine Empire through routeways across the Mediterranean and into the Atlantic, where this material is probably being redistributed to Britain. So we had a symposium at Newcastle, which we were very pleased to publish in 2020, bringing together authors working on this material in this region, including Jussi Carlos. So we're very pleased that we've kept in contact. And what I'm hoping is from that, or continuing from that, is that we've kept these sort of connections going so that researchers working in Britain can stay in the loop about the exciting research that's going on in Spain, Portugal, and France, and across the Mediterranean. And what we're seeing now is that there's a sort of expanding range of types of material circulating in the late antique Atlantic, suggesting a kind of much greater complexity of exchange. So just some sort of new, as I've mentioned, the finds in Britain really aren't unique and probably indicative of indirect links with the East Mediterranean. And probably what we have are routes of transmission whereby luxury goods are flowing northward into the Atlantic. So potentially material that we don't have archaeological evidence for, but also we have the amphoras, so we're suggesting maybe wine being quite important as a commodity flowing north into the Atlantic, and probably raw materials moving southward, things like metal, but also maybe some organic commodities and things like that as well. And that continental phase of connection that I mentioned, something continuing into the later 6th or 7th, it's actually a sort of continuation of the same systems, wider Atlantic changes into this period. But as I've mentioned, the Mediterranean material really seems to stop in Britain by the mid-6th century. Okay, so this takes us to Tintagel, which is, as I mentioned, the site with the largest quantities of these imported finds. As you can see, it's a coastal headland site, a very windswept site with very changeable weather on the north coast of Cornwall. And you can see that it's just off the coast. It's technically not an island because there is it is sort of connected to the mainland, and you can see there's a bridge there. And in the past, there would have been more of a land bridge connecting the two, but that has eroded away, so that there is now a bridge sort of connecting the two areas. So if we take you to the site, these walls that you can see here are from this sort of later medieval castle that was built at the site in the 13th century. And we think that this is because of the interest of the sort of earlier settlement at the site, that the site has this potentially royal connections, and that this later castle was built kind of linking with that story of power and place at the site. But there is a sort of gap in dating terms between the post-Roman settlement and this later medieval phase of activity. So this is in the visitor centre at the site, and you can see some of the range of imported material. There's a reconstructed glass in there, but you can see this combed late Roman II amphora, some of the glasswares from the site, and some of the fine wares in the bottom there, the late Roman C, and some of the African material as well. The things at the top are slate discs that were used to seal, potentially to seal some of the vessels. And it's been suggested that these might have been used for some of the amphoras, to reuse them. Just to show you some of the material that's in the museum, the bulk of the finds are in the Royal Cornwall Museum in Truro, which is the sort of county city of Cornwall, but is not a very large city, but has a very, very impressive museum. So the site has this sort of mythological connection to King Arthur, who was reportedly born at the site. And this is an older image that was used for visitors at the site, and you can see the importance being placed on the imported Mediterranean finds that are presented as arriving directly from the East Mediterranean at the site, and being presented to this royal person. This is the sort of later version of this, where again, you can see these imported amphoras arriving at the site and being distributed. But by this point, they're suggesting that...
Retrocede un poquito, María.
Sorry? Oh, sorry, I missed, did someone? Ah.
There was some sound, but that's okay.
Oh, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Suggesting that this was arriving through chains of transmission up the Atlantic. So just some images from the site. You can see this new bridge that was built connecting the mainland part of the site to the headland, and you can see the walls of the 13th century castle. But this later structure does overlay the earlier archaeology, and this is looking the other way. And in fact, these post-Roman imports are found right the way across the headland, the island, and also onto the mainland parts of the site. So it extends right across the area. The sort of first excavations at the site were from the 1930s, where all of this ceramic material started to be sort of recorded, and it was found in association with these stone-built rectangular structures. And there was an assumption that this material was connected to these structures coming up from the site, potentially buildings of the same period. So here's Raleigh Radford, who was conducting this phase of excavations at the site. And you can see the sort of turf walls are marking out these buildings in the foreground there. And these are the areas that he identified at the site as having these stone-built structures where material of post-Roman date was coming up from the excavations in association with these buildings. Just to mention, if you look across from the headland, you can see this church, which is St. Materiana's, and there is also some imported wares over in the churchyard there. So there seems to be a link between the site on the headland, as is mentioned, potentially a royal site, and then potentially a sort of ecclesiastical site on the mainland part. And also, there was a phase of excavations in the 90s where they were investigating some of these stone-built structures, and they found an inscribed slate. And there was a suggestion at the time that this had a mention of Arthur, but that has been discounted now. But again, they were finding imported ceramics. One of the most recent phases of work, and the biggest sort of phase of work for a long time at the site, was on the southern part of the site, where in 2016 and in 2017 there was an excavation to look at these stone-built structures and to try and work out what these buildings were and how they related to the archaeology. So on this southern part, there was trenches put in on earthwork structures, which were thought to be potentially buildings. And if you remember that earlier map I showed of the areas where these potential buildings were at the site, a later survey showed that these same earthworks were right the way across the headland part of the site. So it was this area on the southern part of the site that was the focus of excavations in 2016 and mostly in 2017. So you can see the large stone walls that were excavated of individual buildings. And here you can see some of the archaeology, but what's interesting is that the deposits that were producing the imported fine wares were underneath these stone walls. suggesting that these buildings are later, and that's been sort of later confirmed by the radiocarbon dates and the stratigraphic analysis. And in fact, this area is sort of characterized by midden deposits full of organic material, with ceramics in, bone evidence, also glasswares, and it's been built up and built up to provide the foundation for these stone-built structures. But at the same time, below this, or it seems that there is a phase potentially of earlier stone-built structures. This was only quite a small area really for the site that was excavated. So there is still questions about this, but it sort of throws a new sort of discussion about the archaeology of the Highland, and how these stone structures relate to the imported ceramics. And what we now think is that this site, rather than necessarily being a sort of settlement, is really geared towards feasting, and that there's a lot of feasting activity going on at the site where these imported wares were used, where wine may have been consumed, and that these midden deposits that we have on the site, these organic deposits, are connected to these feasting activities, which may be linked to the sort of development of a place or a community, and potentially to the kind of the royal power of the site. So from this excavations, they found another inscribed slate. What's interesting is that it had text on in Brittonic, it had Latin and also Greek. You can see there were Greek sort of monograms on there. So whether this was a sort of trial piece or it was sort of someone marking sort of various markings at the time, but it does suggest a level of literacy at the site. So I was lucky enough to be carrying out the analysis of the imported wares coming from this new phase of investigation, and you can see some of the fine wares at the front here. Various other people working at the site. Carl Thorpe worked on the ceramics, and we were lucky that Dr. Adolfo Fernandez also came to give me some suggestions of the material in comparison to some of the finds from Vigo. So there's the publication of the excavations will be out this year. So this will all be available in the publication. I'm looking forward to seeing this come out soon. But I'll show you some of the pictures of the material and some of the information on the finds that we have coming from this most recent excavation. So we've got 14 vessels of late Roman sea fineware. And in fact, this is a very large amount for Britain. We don't have huge amounts of material, but on a British scale, this is actually a large amount, all of which are of a kind of Hayes form 3. So we don't have any of the later forms. So it's kind of subtypes variants of Hayes 3. And you can see some of the other examples of these fineware that we have coming from the excavations. We do have a couple of sherds of African red slip. There are more within the wider assemblage, but 2 vessels from this most recent excavation and that DSPA as well. All of these seem to be suggesting a similar date. So late 5th century, first half of the 6th century seems to be what we're getting from the fineware. Just to show you, this is what the sherds tend to look like. Because of the soils at the site, they're often quite stained, which can be difficult for identification. So these are washed, they're just really quite stained. So in terms of the amphoras that we have from this most recent excavation, late Roman 1 amphoras, as I said, all of those suggesting dates in that later 5th, first half of the 6th century, probably from southern Turkey, Cilicia, that sort of area. Late Roman 2 amphoras. We have late Roman 3, small quantities again, but we also have other amphoras that initially we called red micaceous as a sort of working group. But later on, we think this might be an Agora M273. So a different kind of amphora than we've had recorded from Britain before. And potentially this is linked to Samosiston, an amphora coming from the sort of central Eastern Aegean area, potentially one of the islands. And we also have larger amphora with thick walls. And this is the group that previously have been thought to be North African. And as I mentioned, Paul Reynolds suggested that they might be from southern Spain. And now we think that a lot of this group potentially relates to amphoras coming from the Huelva region, like this La Orden amphora, which has been studied in the region. Just to show you some of the amphora data, mostly what we have is late Roman I, late Roman II, and then certainly largest by weight and the kind of third by count are these Huelva region amphoras. We do have some courseware, quite small amounts, and just the odd vessel, which include this mortarium, which Paul Reynolds suggested to me might be African, but unfortunately this didn't get any petrological analysis. So I'm still hoping to find a potential parallel for this. Some of the sherds have dipinti. We have sort of one sherd from the excavation with a dipinto, sherds with graffiti. And this sherd that seems to have been used as a sort of marker or a counter for not within these notches on it, you can see here. So the material that's arriving at Tintagel now, we can suggest is coming from quite a range of sources, from the East Mediterranean, sort of northeast corner, the Aegean region, Tunisia area, potentially now southern Spain, and also from southwestern France. So as well as that specialist analysis for the new excavations, I've been carrying out analysis of the entire assemblage of material that's been collected at the site for the last 120 years or more. So this, after the excavation is published, I'll be looking to get this wider assemblage data published. But just to show you some of the information, these are kind of preliminary results. Oh, sorry, I'm getting mixed up. This is from the excavation. I'll come on to the wider assemblage, but just to show you, yes, over 2,000 sherds from the most recent excavation. As I've mentioned, mostly amphora and late Roman I. So this is from the most recent excavation. And just to mention that there has been a comprehensive program of radiocarbon dating at the site, led by Historic England Head of Scientific Dating, Professor Alex Bayliss, working with the director of this excavation, Jackie Nowakowski. And the radiocarbon dates are suggesting that the phase of activity we have for these midden deposits that I mentioned is quite a constrained date. So it's potentially just a couple of decades on either side of AD 500. So a couple of decades in the later 5th century, or potentially the second quarter of the 6th century, which seems most likely. And that these imported finds, the post-Roman ceramics, also the glass, and also this faunal evidence, falls within those dates. And then there are later phases of activity at the site, but the suggestion is that these imported wares are all residual in these later phases. So this is the material coming up from those later phases, and there does seem to be a drop-off in the weight of the amphora, which potentially suggests that they're being more abraded, and that by this later phase they're all they are residual or redeposited, and this phase 1 is our post-Roman phase of activity connected to feasting evidence shown up from these middens, and that the date for that is quite constrained and probably looking at the second quarter of the 6th century, which is quite interesting dating for those fine wares and for the amphoras that we have as well. Just to show you, we have a late Roman 3 amphora with the graffito on, which is Greek. Unfortunately, not enough to decipher, but we do have parallels for late Roman 3 amphora, Ephesus and Athens, which have writing on, graffiti on, that are probably suggesting the contents, possibly some kind of sweet wine or spiced wine. So yes, as I mentioned, I was also doing this postdoctoral research project investigating the entire wider assemblage from the site, which included petrological and chemical analysis in collaboration with the British School of Athens Fitch Laboratory, with Evangelia Kyriatsi and Noemi Muller. So we sampled 103 samples of the entire range of material right across the whole history of work at the site. So this is what will be published after the TCOP excavation report. So you can see just over 7,000 sherds in total. Most of these are amphoras. Of the amphoras, mostly late Roman 1, late Roman 2. Also those sort of Huelva region amphora types, and a few examples of other types of amphora, as I've mentioned, that Agora M273 sort of family of amphoras that we really need to try and do some more work to fully understand, as well as fine wares, African red slip, late Roman C, and a smaller amount of the DSPA fine ware from the Bordeaux region. So I won't spend very long on this, but just to show you that the petrological analysis has been ongoing, and then this will be published. In terms of the late Roman 1 and late Roman 2, most of the samples are quite similar, suggesting that the material's quite coherent as a group, but there are a few outliers, so it's not identical in terms of the material. And a similar story for the late Roman 3. You can see the sort of mica schist in the petrology here. We took some samples of this working group that we called red micaceous, and actually the fabrics are quite different within this, suggesting that there might be a couple of source regions, different areas producing amphoras of this similar kind of shape. So that's something different for the site. The fabrics were quite different between some of the samples, as I mentioned, suggesting that this sort of family of amphoras from the Aegean was maybe made in a few different places with different types of fabrics as well. And I already talked about that B5 group of amphora that we now think is coming from southern Spain. We did some petrology of this, and the group as it was quite varied. But what we were able to show is that there is almost no North African amphoras at Tintagel. They're really very rare at the site, and there was none from the most recent excavations. So as I said, this will be published, the results of the petrology and the chemical analysis as well. But what we're seeing is that there is a sort of wider range of material at Tintagel than previously thought. And we're now hoping to sort of connect that to some of the source regions and also see how that compares to other sites in Britain and Ireland. So just for the last couple of minutes, I'm going to just talk to you about some of the sort of wider questions that we have emerging from this evidence. although the quantities of fine wares aren't huge, it does seem now that Tintagel did have a real demand for dining wares, for tablewares that were probably used for eating. At some of the other sites in Britain that have these fine wares, it might be just that they're oddities. There tends to be only a couple of examples, but Tintagel does seem to have a larger group, suggesting that they might have been used for dining. And that there was a kind of demand for dining, and how that relates to wider patterns in the Atlantic, to sort of post-Roman communities in Spain or Portugal, whether the people in Britain were sort of emulating practices in the wider Atlantic or connecting to them in some way, we need to think about. What's interesting is that these fine wares are, of course, connected to contemporary precious metal vessels, and we have no evidence of this from the site, but is that something that's been lost from the site, if it's a royal site, if it's a rich site? And these fine wares and metal vessels of the same date, they seem to connect to communal dining practices, and is all the archaeological evidence that we're seeing from feasting at the site, are we seeing sort of communal dining, people eating from these large vessels? Were they being used within these sort of feasting occasions? And just as I mentioned, this is a map of sites that do have fine wares, and they are really quite rare. Most of the sites just have a couple of examples. So Tintagel really is quite unusual in the quantity of fine ware, although it's not on a Mediterranean scale by any measure. I'll just skim over this one. But also just to mention that the fine wares, we don't have this sort of the quantities that they have from some sites in the Atlantic, like here at Vigo, but also we don't have the range of dates. This is sort of symbolized by the late Roman C forms. We don't have Hayes 10, for example, in the UK, suggesting that, again, this phase of activity is a fairly constrained date. Just to mention that these imported wares are continuing to appear, and that we're quite interested in how the site at Tintagel connects to sites in the wider region. Is Tintagel the sort of controlling royal site, where this material is kind of controlled and then filters out into these sites in the sort of wider landscape? This is a site at Roach, which is inland in Cornwall, and has recently produced quite small amounts of material, but very similar to Tintagel. And it may be that this site was sort of connected through political relationships or power relationships with the key site at Tintagel. And I mentioned this sort of recognition of 12 region amphoras, which hopefully will be published. We, myself and Adolfo presented this at the Expetica conference, and hopefully this will be published as well, and just to show you these links. But these amphoras are also seem to be present at other sites in Britain and Ireland. So this is at Bantham, but there's a suggestion that there's maybe some of these amphoras from Ireland or from other sites in southwestern Britain, as well as some other types of amphoras, that now we have this new evidence from Tintagel, we can start to look at some of these rarities at other sites in the UK too. So yeah, here you can see some of the thick walled, these amphoras coming from Bantham were described as thick walled, but this might be one of these sort of Laodan amphoras potentially. And the other kind of implications coming out of this, I think, are related to dating, and there has been discussions about dating of some of these fine wares in the East Mediterranean, particularly, and I'm very open to sort of reevaluating what's the evidence for our sort of dates. And I know Jose Carlos does a lot of work on fine wares, forms and variants, looking at dates and typologies. In the East Mediterranean, Guy Sanders has suggested that all of this material needs to be moved a century later, which is an interesting sort of idea. But what we're seeing from the radiocarbon dates and the links with these fine wares coming from Tintagel seems to kind of reinforce a sort of more traditional chronology. And as I mentioned, that kind of quite close date for the material. So I will leave it there, but thank you for your time and attention. And unfortunately, I live in Newcastle, but if you are ever in Cornwall, I would really recommend seeing Tintagel. And if anyone would like to talk more about the material from Britain, please do get in touch. So thank you very much for having me this evening, and I'd be more than happy to answer any questions.